For 5 months, the United States military said one thing over and over, no matter how many tankers burned. The southern route through the Strait of Hormuz is open. Nobody needs Iran's permission to use it. Iran said the opposite. It said the strait belonged to no one but Tehran, and that every ship crossing it would answer to Iranian terms. Then, in the span of about 48 hours this week, that standoff cracked. Not with a missile, not with a ceasefire, with a set of coordinates. Iran agreed to them. Oman helped write them. And buried inside that quiet technical announcement is something the Pentagon has been trying to get since the day this crisis began. A defined shipping corridor that doesn't run through Iran's permission first. Stay with us, because what this agreement actually contains, and what it leaves out, tells you more about who's winning this standoff than any headline will. Quick context. This all traces back to February 28th of this year. That's the day the United States and Israel launched a coordinated strike against Iran, opening with the killing of Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei. Within hours, Iran answered the only way it could reach beyond its own borders. It shut the Strait of Hormuz, the narrow waterway that, at the time, carried roughly a fifth of the world's oil and a similar share of its liquefied natural gas. Iran's Revolutionary Guard didn't just declare the strait closed, it enforced that closure. Warnings went out over marine radio. Ships that ignored them got boarded, disabled, or turned around. By April, the United States had responded with its own countermove, a naval blockade aimed at Iranian ports, paired with an air campaign meant to force the strait back open by force if diplomacy couldn't do it. A brief ceasefire came in April, collapsed, came back, collapsed again. By early August, the pattern had become almost routine. Talk of a deal, then an attack that undid the talk. Through all of it, one argument never changed. Washington insisted the strait was an international waterway, and that no single country got to charge tolls or dictate who passed through it. Tehran insisted the opposite, that the strait ran through Iranian territorial waters, and Iranian sovereignty came with the right to control it. That single disagreement is the entire war in miniature. And this week, for the first time, one side moved. The timeline. On Tuesday, August 4th, U.S. Central Command posted a statement that had become almost a talking point by that point in the war. The southern route through the strait, the one that runs through Omani waters rather than hugging the Iranian coast, remained open to commercial traffic. CENTCOM added a number to back it up. American forces had escorted more than 1,000 vessels safely through that corridor over the previous 3 months alone, despite what the command called ongoing Iranian aggression. That statement alone wasn't new. CENTCOM had been saying versions of it for weeks. What was new came the very next day. On Wednesday, August 5th, Iran's foreign ministry spokesman, Esmail Baghaei, confirmed that after roughly 2 months of negotiations, Iran and Oman had finalized the geographic coordinates for a shipping route through the strait. A joint statement was being drafted, covering technical, legal, security, and environmental terms. Iranian state television described the arrangement as a middle corridor, one that would sit under joint Iranian-Omani administration rather than Iranian control alone. That same day, U.S. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent told reporters the United States and Iran could reach a broader deal within days, one that would guarantee freedom of navigation without Iranian transit fees. He pointed to the scale of what was waiting on the other side of an agreement, potentially over 1,000 ships sitting idle, carrying everything from crude oil to fertilizer to industrial gas, all stalled by 5 months of uncertainty. 2 announcements, 1 day apart, both pointing toward the same outcome, a defined route, fixed coordinates, something that could be tracked, verified, and defended, instead of a vague standoff over who owns which stretch of water. Why this is what the military actually wanted. Here's the part that's easy to miss if you only read the headline. Iran agreeing to fixed coordinates isn't a minor technical update. It's close to the exact outcome U.S. Central Command has been describing as the solution since this crisis began. Think about what a blockade like this actually costs a military day to day. Every ship that enters the strait without a clearly defined, mutually recognized path is a judgment call. Which stretch of water counts as safe, which patrol boat is a threat, and which one is routine. Every one of those judgment calls takes time, resources, and risk, multiplied across more than 1,000 vessels over 3 months. A named corridor, with coordinates both sides have agreed to, turns that constant judgment call into something closer to a fixed rule. Ships either stay inside the lines or they don't. That distinction matters enormously to a military trying to protect commercial shipping without triggering a wider war every time a tanker gets close to Iranian waters. That's also precisely the argument a U.S. official made directly to Al Jazeera around the same time. According to that report, temporary routes through the strait wouldn't require permits, approvals, or fees from any single country because no one nation controls navigation through an international waterway. That's the American position, restated in almost every public comment on this crisis for 5 months. And for the first time, Iran's own diplomats have put their name on a document that moves in that direction, even if they haven't said so in those words. This is the shift CENTCOM has been describing as already true. Iran agreeing to shared coordinates is Iran acting, on paper at least, as though it might be true too. The catch nobody's ignoring now. Here's where this story stops being simple. Because the same day Baghai confirmed the coordinates agreement, he also drew a hard line around what it actually means. An agreement with Oman, he said, does not by itself make the strait safe for passing vessels. The real obstacles, in his framing, are the American naval blockade and continued strikes on Iranian territory, and those remain firmly in place. In other words, Iran is agreeing to the geography of a corridor, while explicitly refusing to agree that the corridor makes anything safer until the U.S. pulls back its own forces first. That's not a minor footnote. That's Iran keeping its central bargaining chip fully loaded, even while handing over the coordinates that look, on the surface, like a concession. And there's a second complication, one that should sound familiar if you followed how Iran's government has handled this war before. The coordinates deal came from Iran's foreign ministry, the diplomatic wing of the government. It did not come from the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, the branch that actually controls the boats, the mines, and the missiles in that stretch of water. Iran's own senior military advisor, Mohsen Rezai, had already rejected the idea that Washington gets to decide the terms of reopening. According to Iranian state media, Rezai made clear Iran would not permit shipping routes it hadn't authorized on its own terms. That statement predates the coordinates announcement, but it hasn't been walked back. Which raises the exact question that has haunted every previous ceasefire in this war. Does an agreement signed by Iran's diplomats actually bind the people holding the weapons? More evidence. The fight overseas. There's one more sticking point buried inside this story, and it's the one most likely to blow the whole arrangement up before it's finalized. Iran has consistently pushed to charge tolls on ships passing through the strait, framing it as a straightforward exercise of sovereign control over its own waters. Iran's parliament has gone further, drafting legislation that would formally bar vessels tied to the United States and Israel from the corridor entirely, along with any ship linked to countries Tehran considers to have caused it harm unless compensation is paid first. The United States and the Gulf states reject that framing entirely, pointing to the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, which treats international straits as open to free passage regardless of whose coastline they border. Bessent's comments about a fee-free corridor weren't a throwaway detail. They were a direct answer to Iran's toll demand, and the two positions are, as of this week, still unresolved. So picture the current state of play. Iran has agreed to where the ships can sail. It has not agreed to who gets to sail there for free, or whether American vessels count at all. Escalation beyond the strait. While the coordinates were being finalized, the wider region kept giving reasons to doubt how stable any of this really is. CNN reported that Saudi Arabia was bracing for what one official described as multiple coordinated attacks, expected from Iraqi militias working alongside Iran-backed Houthi forces. The Houthis themselves had already claimed a fresh strike on a Saudi tanker that same week, one of the furthest south they'd targeted since their blockade campaign began, with their military spokesperson claiming the group had turned back 29 separate tankers over the previous month alone. None of that activity runs through the Strait of Hormuz corridor being negotiated with Oman. It's happening in parallel, in the Red Sea and along the Saudi coastline, driven by groups aligned with Iran, but not directly bound by anything Iran's foreign ministry signs. It's a reminder that even a fully finalized Hormuz agreement wouldn't end the broader pressure campaign Iran and its allies have built across the region since February. There's also a quieter piece of context worth knowing. Around the same time these negotiations were unfolding, reports emerged that the Pentagon's own munition stockpiles were running lower than officials wanted to admit publicly, prompting private frustration from the White House about how that perception affected leverage at the negotiating table. Publicly, the administration insisted supplies remained more than sufficient. Whether that's a factor in why Washington seems eager to lock in a defined corridor now, rather than continue an open-ended blockade indefinitely, is something no official has confirmed. But the timing is hard to ignore. Real-world consequences? Step back from the diplomacy for a second and look at what's actually been sitting at anchor. By Bessent's own estimate, more than 1,000 vessels have been stuck waiting on some kind of resolution, loaded with crude oil, refined fuel, fertilizer, and industrial gas that the global economy has been functioning without for 5 months. Every week that backlog holds is a week of elevated shipping insurance costs, delayed deliveries, and price pressure that ripples out from the Gulf to ports on the other side of the planet. For ordinary consumers, that's shown up as fuel price volatility that never quite settles. For the shipping industry, it's meant longer, more expensive routes around the region entirely, for any operator unwilling to risk the strait no matter what CENTCOM says about its safety. And for the Gulf states themselves, from Saudi Arabia to the UAE, it's meant living with the possibility of attack on their own energy infrastructure as collateral damage in a fight that isn't really about them. A finalized corridor, if it holds, would be the first real off-ramp from that reality since the war began. If it doesn't hold, it becomes one more diplomatic milestone that made headlines and changed nothing on the water. What to watch next? 3 things will tell you which version of this story is actually happening. First, watch whether the joint Iran-Oman statement on the corridor's technical and legal terms actually gets published, and whether it includes language on fees. If Iran walks back the fee-free framing Besant described, or insists on tolls anyway, that's a sign the diplomatic breakthrough is smaller than it looks. Second, watch the Revolutionary Guard, not the Foreign Ministry. If IRGC vessels continue boarding or disabling ships inside the new corridor's coordinates after it's finalized, that tells you everything about whether Iran's military actually answers to its diplomats, the same question that undid the ceasefires back in April. Third, watch whether the U.S. naval blockade of Iranian ports actually eases in response. Bagay was explicit that Iran considers the blockade the real obstacle to safety, not the missing coordinates. If Washington keeps the blockade in place, even after the corridor is signed, expect Tehran to argue the deal was never honored in the first place, and expect the standoff to keep grinding on exactly where it's been for months. Final thought. For 5 months, the U.S. military said the same thing on a loop. There is a safe way through Hormuz, and it doesn't require Iran's permission. Iran spent those same 5 months proving, ship by ship, that it disagreed. This week, for the first time, Iran's own government put its signature on coordinates for a route it doesn't fully control, on paper at least, conceding the exact point Washington has been making since February. Whether that concession survives contact with Iran's own military, and with Iran's own conditions about the blockade, is still completely open. But something shifted this week that hadn't shifted in 5 months of war. Iran finally agreed to something. Now the only question left is who inside Iran actually has to follow it. Thanks for watching. If you want the next update on this the moment it breaks, subscribe and turn on notifications. And let us know in the comments. Do you think the Revolutionary Guard honors this corridor? Or does it end up like every ceasefire before it?